Okay.
Hi. Hello. Hi. Please PY me in chat. Sorry, wait. I'm trying to sort the split screen situation. Okay, cool. All right. 3, 2, 1. Let's go. Unfortunately, the world that we had before is not the one we live in today. Often, things like integration, buy-in, the ability to open up your borders towards diffusion and globalization are all necessary in order for certain communities, especially those that are being represented by marginalized and minority individuals, to survive. We would suggest on our end, this motion would look like 4 things. First, it would be to support things like assimilation. So it looks like migrating towards urban cities, adopting, for example, the language and colloquial linguistics, for example, of the people around you. Perhaps even when you're, for example, pursuing a job, you will use a different name that sounds a little bit more English and a little bit more white as opposed to the ethnic name that you were provided. In the case, for example, of women, it would look like, for example, leaning in, being able to relate more to your male colleagues such that it becomes significantly easier for you, for example, to be perceived as someone who's promotable. Second, it's also about addressing appropriation. So, for example, it's also understanding that other individuals who may not be within your own ethnic, racial, or religious, for example, minority can also participate in your customs and cultures. But obviously, later on, we'll discuss that this does not automatically mean that we support that you will support bastardizing our culture, or leaders rather should not support bastardizing their culture. But why exactly is it easy to deal with those who will bastardize your culture in a world wherein we side with government? That's the third thing we support is diffusion. So this looks like localization, how indigenous tribes, while they may continue, for example, the practice of having certain tattoos done by people within their community, they would loosen the regulations for practitioners. So instead, if initially it was only people from your indigenous community, now it will just be those people, but also we can open up the practice and passing down the tradition towards other individuals who may not be part of that community to ensure the interest such that more people will be able to carry on with this tradition. But the last thing is that this debate exists on a spectrum because there are different types of minorities with different types of contexts. So it can range, for example, from identity politics such as feminism, BLM, most of individuals who exist mostly in urban spaces, but also can include, for example, individuals who live in the indigenous communities. The first argument I want to put forward is economic scrutiny, or rather economic security. And the first part of this is professional advancement. There are a couple of reasons why we would suggest that, for example, a lot of the constituents of these followers, those who are immigrants, for example, those who live in urbanized or even semi-rural areas, for example, would be able to benefit greatly from this policy. First, it becomes significantly easier for them to assert themselves economically. If they want to pursue a promotion, for example, it's likely for them to get it because they're not othered, or, for example, they adhere to a lot of the cultures that their, more majoritarian culture colleagues adhere to. Second of all, often they increase the social capital. So insofar as they're seen as someone who's relatable, they're seen as someone who's able to integrate and vibe with them, essentially, they're more likely to grow their networks, which makes them more likely to advance themselves economically, gain, for example, a promotion, be able to gain more career opportunities in the future if they want to create a job shift. But third, broadly, this all means is that they get their foot in the door, which means that they're more likely to have more opportunities to make more money and other things like that. Why is this important? Not just to the people in question, but also to the leader. First, often the constituents of minority leaders are often immigrants. A lot of them are immigrants, for example, are people who migrate in order to have greener pastures. And in order in a world wherein they're allowed to achieve more economic security or, for example, more professional opportunities, this is something that's in line with the protection of these individuals and therefore within the interest of this leader. Second, there's a lot of economic impact. So, for example, which also leads to social impact with regards to insofar as they have a job, they have a lot of economic security. They're not too busy trying to fixate themselves with their own rent. They're more likely to have more time, for example, to reconnect with their culture, visit their families at home, for example, donate towards charities that benefit the minorities at the end of the day. And while opposition may come here and try to cheat this argument by saying that, well, on your end, you have to force them to become automatically white or automatically part of the majority in culture, that's only publicly. They're allowed to do these things privately insofar as it doesn't compromise their social integration. But lastly, this also increases individual capacity to take care of the elderly, their ancestors, which is often a common interest across minority groups. and, for example, with regards to donating to charities. The second part of this argument is with regards to globalization. We would suggest three things. First of all, the practice becomes significantly more accessible insofar as you loosen the regulations such that you allow more people to practice it, you allow more people to appropriate it. But second, for example, you broaden its popularity by allowing more people to discuss it and recognize that there are certain types of practices that you still do within your culture. But third, there are a lot of benefits toward this. So, for example, things like tourism, insofar as people go to your neighboring countries, to your native communities, for example. Second, often they purchase your products and services that are inherent towards your locality. But lastly, broadly, insofar as they see as benefit you because they have more integration and they see your culture more, for example, it's things like supporting lands, supporting policy, such that it's likely to be integrated there. So while it is true that you will loosen regulations, for example, you have to forego certain practices within tattooing, for example, or certain practices within your community, the idea that you were able to make it more palatable to individuals who visit your locality, who practice, for example, some of the common traditions or events that you have, while they may be appropriated by definition, allows them, for example, to gain more traction in trying to ensure that things like your land, things like your culture won't be apprehended by the state or other individuals who may compromise it altogether. But before I proceed, CO.
Yeah, so just to be clear, the motion asks you to defend social integration. What are you also defending all forms of cultural appropriation of your culture in order to be more understood and accepted by majority communities?
First of all, yes. Second of all, since it's Shaun, Leeds United. This is important for a couple of reasons. First, it's security. As a leader, you are not omnipresent. You do not have the means to watch over every individual and ensure that they're protected. And often economic security is one of the main ways towards protection, insofar as you can have more money to live in a gated community, you have more money to pay yourself and bail yourself out of jail, and other things that are salient towards the protection of these minorities. But second, often with access to relatability, understand that they will bastardize you on either way, which is probably going to be the closing opposition extension. But what is important here is that you give yourself the means to be seen and heard. And this is precisely what we're going to talk about in the next argument with regards to perception and image. We would suggest that not only does it happen either way, but on opposition's end, it happens significantly worse because you isolate yourselves from them, because they isolate you. You don't have friends and colleagues that you can correct, for example, if they have misinterpretations about your culture. We would suggest that it's bad for you, not because you don't control the narrative of how you're being bastardized, but you as a leader also have to deal with the effects of having a protectionist culture. This is rectified on opening government because, first of all, we allow integration to allow people to change this bastardization personally. When they correct their friends, and those friends use that information to correct their own friends, and that broad network creates a culture of trying to correct each other about their misconceptions about culture. Second of all, it's about integration into bigger structures like media, like news. Insofar as you become more palatable to the public, you're able to be put in news outlets, for example, given features similar to how Wang Od in the Philippines was given features by multiple news outlets and multiple magazines. And while it is true that you may not always be able to fully talk about your culture, you're still able, for example, to clarify, to advocate for certain policies, for example, to advocate for certain interests that you may not have been able to done if you continue to be protectionist. For all these reasons and more, propose.
Right. Thank you very much to the Prime Minister for that speech. To begin the case for the opposition bench, inviting the leader of opposition. You're here.
Hi, can you give me a second?
Yeah, sure.
Let's go get water. Hi, okay, give me a second to start my timer. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I think that Beatrice doesn't really take into consideration the context of this motion, because I think that if you are a marginalized community, you are unlikely to get many of the benefits that she talks about, because you are going to be discriminated regardless of whether or not you are willing to give out your culture or not. I want to note that she doesn't really prove things. Like, she says that people will like you more or see your culture more, but it's unclear why that necessarily means that it leads to lesser discrimination or greater ability to get more economic prosperity for your own minority community groups. Notice that there are reasons why you probably will fail, even if you're able to socially integrate under their side. And the reason for this is that, firstly, you are probably you as a minority community are already at an economic disadvantage in comparison to the majority community. Notice that it's the majority community incentive to always want to put you down, so not to give you jobs, for instance, or not to pay you high salaries, because they also benefit from your cheap labor as a minority community, which is to say that it's unlikely that even if you give up certain cultural aspects, that it changes the way in which individuals look at you. It's likely that you are then going to be suppressed anyways. But notice that people also aren't really good actors. The fact that you have been marginalized within these kinds of societies also means that people don't really care or look fondly at your kind of minority group. It means that they are not going to look at the they're not going to give you jobs or like make you feel good in and of itself. But notice that culture plays a very important aspect within these kinds of minority groups. Not only the ability to self-actualize or to look good or to feel happy about yourself, but it's also the fact that it decreases the ability for you as a group of individuals to have the ability to collectivize. And we think that that's fundamentally important. What's opening opposition's case today? I think our biggest contribution today is we're going to prove to you how is it that at the point where you lose certain cultural aspects, it makes it much harder for you as a minority group to collectivize, which in and of itself mean that you get lesser ability to unite against certain things against the majority group. The first thing I want to answer is what does culture necessarily mean to people and mean to these kinds of minority groups? We think that culture fundamentally is the way in which you see the world, and it's the way in which you interpret your lived experiences. It's a set of activities that unite a certain group of people to a certain group of people. A set of activities or set of like beliefs that unite a certain group of people, and it's a way in which people self-actualize and interpret their own world. So culture is integral to the understanding of what your life is and how you interpret life in and of itself. But in the context of a collective group setting, culture is also important because it's the sole distinction, it's the only thing that ties a group of people together. Notice that like certain aspects, like the way you look in terms of like your skin color, are arbitrary in and of itself, because people can have different kinds of skin color, people can have different kinds of personality traits, so on and so on. But what is consistent and what is able to bring certain groups of people together is these shared lived experiences between one another, which comes in the form of cultural practices. And recognize that therefore there's no other way to tie your own minority group together at the point where you lose out on things like culture. What this means that at the point where they're likely to be appropriated or used in the worst ways possible is a point in which you then lose out on the ability to collect for your own group to identify themselves and to push forward on their own collective goals. I want to note that the kinds of things that are likely to get appropriated are probably the most meaningful things towards these kinds of minority groups. And the reason for this is that they are often the most obvious things to people, because often the majority group that appropriates these kinds of like cultural aspects of that the majority group doesn't really understand what the minority group necessarily means. So you don't know that your own minority group have these kinds of cultural practices, or they cannot relate to the lived experiences of you because they don't interact with you enough. The point of this is that what they are likely to therefore appropriate are the most obvious and most important things from these kinds of minority groups. For instance, in South Africa, when the white population took the totems of like the South African people and like sold them as souvenirs, for instance, even though those totems mean a lot in terms of the spiritual meaning towards these kinds of African minority groups, bastardizing them as a result. But notice that even in the most charitable interpretation of the majority group, even if we assume that majority people are really nice individuals who genuinely care about minority groups, often because of the fact that there's a difference in terms of understanding between these cultural aspects and the people in the majority, it often means that they will never know or understand what these kinds of cultural aspects is. So they're likely to disrespect the usage of these kinds of cultural aspects, bastardizing them as a result as well. The end result is that your culture as a minority community gets stripped away, gets taken away, and is used in extremely disrespectful ways. What are the impacts of this? We think that in the absence of culture, you firstly have a lesser ability to collectivize, because now you don't have that unique thing to fall back on. It's difficult for you to give your group a collective identity, so like you fade into the background and the shadows, so you don't have the ability to push forward certain kinds of goals already. But secondly, at the point where you are successful in terms of like social integration, we think that that's a bad thing also for two reasons. The first is that this is often a point of no return, because at the point where you legitimize the usage of your own culture as a minority leader, it's a point when you legitimize the majority's usage and appropriation of your culture, you cannot stop them from continuously taking other aspects of your own minority culture away from your community in and of itself. So notice that it's probably going to lead to it leads to a cycle in which the majority community continuously takes away your own culture. But the second reason why this is bad is notice that what culture is in and of itself is that it makes you obvious towards society. It makes you seen within society. So for instance, like Bangladeshi workers in Singapore are often like marginalized and not talked about. But the fundamental reason is because we don't really care about their culture. Like Singaporeans don't care about their culture or what makes them unique. So they're often invisible in the eyes of many Singaporeans. Before I continue, I'll take one point of information on closing. Opening.
Culture is already being compromised when firms and the state try to lock your land, kill you. But if you don't have integration with the majority culture, it's quite unlikely that these things will be protected. So your idea of culture is also
but you don't prove that integration happens anyways. And also like notice that I'll talk about it more, but the third problem is therefore that you split minority communities apart at a point where some individuals don't care, like don't want to let their culture be given up, but at the point in which you yourself want your culture to be given up in order to get greater social integration. But notice that the worst case that happens, and this is the counterfactual, is that you're able to get safe spaces within our communities. Recognize that like insofar as you cannot get social integration, that you always be disenfranchised. The best alternative therefore is to have communities that can protect one another through certain safe spaces. For example, living in your own community in and of itself. But notice that also, and what is important is that in the process of protecting and sustaining your culture, you are able to have the ability to self-actualize and able to feel good about the fact that you still have these kinds of culture. So what that is to say that you still feel like you can still attain a certain level of catharsis or happiness, knowing that your culture or what makes you unique still stands in the light of things like discrimination or disenfranchisement. So those are things that are important because it deals with the worst case scenario coming out from opening government. For all these reasons, we are proud to oppose.
All right, thank you very much to the Leader of Opposition for that speech. Now to continue the case for OG, inviting the DBN. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. PYs in the chat from closing. I'll take one between 5th and 6th. If I call for it and you don't have one, I won't be able to take you. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, where do you get money? Where do you survive, which is a prerequisite to this whole cultural discussion. 2, where does culture better progress and thrive? But thirdly, in the worst case of appropriation, why do we still win? OO says that you are not going to be hired because you're still not as white as the majority and you're still never going to be like them, right? We tell you that firstly, we agree with this, but comparatively, you are still able to gain forms of employment because of your unique selling proposition as a minority, right? Sure, you might not be as white, you might not be as good at English, but firstly, you are relatively cheaper labor, right? If you are economically disadvantaged, then that is your unique selling point. The fact that you don't have or demand the same amount of pay as the majority and you don't have the same level of working conditions that you need, right? Secondly, the fact that you're especially hardworking because of your background of oppression, the fact that you probably grinded from the very start to learn 2 languages at once, the fact that you traveled all the way to the city and to learn all these things means that you're probably better at hustling and learning a craft better, and therefore they're probably going to hire you a lot better, right? You probably also have better stamina because of your agricultural background, doing backbreaking stuff like weaving, right? They might say on op, oh, that's oppressive. You shouldn't take those lower pays, but you don't realize the comparative. because OO loses when they never talk to you how they will get money. Because the reality of minority cultures nowadays is that they are not getting money from anything. The fact that agriculture is harder to do because of climate events and because they cannot be connected to the big cities who are self-sustaining in and of itself. The fact that minority cultures are dying and people aren't willing to travel anymore to the outskirts of the regions or to rural areas to consume this culture, and therefore they can't sell their their cultural products unless they allow it to be appropriated to a certain extent, right? That is immediately losing from them. But if you believe all of the cultural arguments about OO, they never responded to our arguments about globalization or even embracing cultural appropriation. If you cannot be white passing, we told you that what you should do then is to export your culture in a way that you still have control over it, but obviously you're willing to pander to the majority a little bit more. That means embracing modernity, right? Having digital versions of these things, changing the designs a little bit to pander to the majority, and like capitalizing on these niche Vox articles or these Lad Bible articles of your culture, and therefore immediately selling the products that are featured in this culture while still maintaining the purity. But obviously, like, you lower the barrier of who can access the culture, right? Like, it's not just your own culture who makes those products. You can employ other people to make your products, and you can sell your products to a lot more other people, right? And this is where we address cultural appropriation, right? With the mitigation that Bea talked about, that this is likelier to be cultural diffusion and not cultural appropriation. Are these minority cultures okay with the culture changing? We tell you yes, right? And this is both in terms of changing yourself, but more importantly, changing your culture, right? Firstly, marginalized minorities are still exposed to global cultures from youth nowadays, right? Oftentimes, the cultures become more interested in global cultures as opposed to their own. Look at how K-pop is more popular than original Filipino music, even in most far-flung reaches of our country. Japanese culture and anime is becoming big in the West, right? And minority groups are no different, right? Because on both sides, technology is available to most minority communities. They are out of necessity, obviously, they need technology, electricity to survive, and out of generally increased quality of life over the past few decades means that you at least have an internet connection, even if you're a minority, right? The youth of minority groups then are most exposed to this. They're more liberal and tech savvy, and they often scorn their own culture because they see it as an imposition upon them, because they rob them of their sense of self when their parents just tell them they have to do their own culture. That's why even if there is a split in minority cultures, the only people who are affected on op are those who are the old generation, the boomers who still want to embrace the culture even though no one likes it anymore. And this is unpopular because these boomers will doom the community to starve anyways, like the entirety of opposition. That's why it's fine if there's a split. We'd say the youth are the most important nowadays. Even if you're a leader, you understand that. And therefore, since the youth want the culture to change, they want modern integration probably, and they are going to embrace this a lot better. But more importantly, if there are out groups of our culture who are genuinely passionate about your own culture, then why not export it to them, right? Think about it, right? The people who want to appropriate our culture are not just randos who want some money, right? They obviously chose it over their own culture. They took a risk on your minority culture, even though the majority culture was more palatable, as Op says, which means these people are genuinely willing to learn the culture and do it purely if it's just made a little bit more accessible to them, and therefore you can still maintain a lot of the purity, right? This looks like Filipinos embracing tourists who are interested in our tattoos and weaving, teaching them how to do it, especially because they also will pay a lot for it, right? So, but in the worst case, again, there's no comparative on op, because if you do love the culture, sanctity is your lowest priority because you need it to survive, right? You need social integration for it to survive. And so if the culture dies because the youth no longer want to export it, right? Because the mainstream out groups do not export it through these things like social media, which have most control over culture, etc., then obviously the culture will die, and therefore there's no value to what they say, right? I'll take the POI now.
Yep. So Bea's POI to OO said that external forces like corporations are going to trample on your culture. Why would these same corporations not appropriate your culture? And when they do, why can't you react to that?
Here's the debate winning weighing. OO is immediately losing, and so will CO, when they say majorities are so oppressive, and yet they say if we stick to our guns, then somehow our culture will survive. Because cultural appropriation happens anyway. This is the worst case, okay? If we can't find those people who will genuinely do our culture, these corporations, at least the comparative on Gov, is where we have greater control over this appropriation and turn it into cultural diffusion, as opposed to op, where the corporations steamroll us regardless. Because at least on Gov, one, you still have control over your own narrative. If you partner with these corporations, the corporations will be able to have your authentic stamp of approval, and to do that, they will probably be willing to forsake whatever mass production they want to do and preserve the culture a bit better. But even if they just basically ask you if you want to partner with them, and yet they don't listen to any of your demands, that's fine. Because at least you have some level of profit and social acceptance in exchange for it. Op might say, oh, this will make you feel really bad because you lose your culture. But Firstly, back home in your own community, you can still do your culture, right? Like you can go back to your province and do the culture there, and that's the only real culture you have left. But when you go back to the city, you don't sell your culture. You sell the basic artifacts, the surface level artifacts that the majority wants, as they said in OO. And this in itself is a form of reparations to the minority culture. As a leader, you determine what reparations you want, and having monetary reparations from the majority is legitimate because you're basically scamming these white people who've oppressed you for so long and at least profiting over their interest in your culture, whatever. Shaun told us we have to defend all forms of cultural appropriation. Actually, we defend cultural appropriation that leads to this social integration. And so obviously we're not integrated if we sell our stuff and don't profit. And therefore, OP has to be the side to defend why you're okay with still having some cultural appropriation and having no control over that narrative. At least they might try to say society's liberalizing and we can try to mitigate this by lobbying for cultural appropriation. No, the narrative is always firmly in control of the majorities. Majorities will only help minorities for their own self-actualization. They're only willing to help indigenous people if they can build resorts on their land. And therefore, on OP, you cannot just lobby and go to governments to have their help because they will not help you in that case.
All right. Thank you very much to the DPM for that speech. And to conclude the opening half of the debate, inviting the dialogue. You're here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Awesome. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The first thing I want to do is to clarify the situation of the marginalized communities, because this is how government adds urgency to the case. They claim that these communities are dying and these people need to integrate into the larger workforce. The first question, though, is why are these communities dying? They just assert that they're dying because presumably like there are bulldozers coming to their reservations. But I don't know exactly what is the structural mechanism behind this. Then, therefore, the more like reasonable assumption is that these communities, because like able to exist for so long, probably have some capacity to have like their own safe space to be self-sufficient. On the second level, exactly what's your tipping point? Okay, sure, on your side you have more money, but you send people away from the communities into different cities, breaking up that communities. So even if they have more money, how do you collectivize that money and what does that money do? But outside of the house, you cannot prove that we don't have enough money. You cannot prove that people are starving and dying on the streets, because honestly, that's the context in this space, like non-debatable, right? If that's the case, I'm not quite sure what is your comparison and why is the discrepancy in the thing that you're fighting for really important. Thirdly, look, this is very strange because presumably you are a marginalized community, the rest of the world hates you, which is why you're living alone on a reservation and they're prejudiced against your people. Relinquishing your culture does not automatically resolve these things, and therefore it doesn't mean because you resolve these things, you can automatically transit back into society. So if that's the case, I don't think government has a lot of urgency backing their case. Next, I'm going to expand the concept of what do these minority groups mean, right? I think it goes beyond just like this kind of like ethnic minorities trapped in the mountains that they talk about. I think this goes deeper. It's about your your unit like religion and racial communities that exist in the city in of themselves, and therefore these communities are marginalized, but they still have some accessibility to job opportunities. They also should include like social, gender, sexual orientation communities from various places. Beyond that, I want to talk about what cultural attributes look like, because they just imply that oftentimes cultural attributes are like your forefathers' practices of like headdress and whatever else passed down from generations. I don't think that's true. Oftentimes, like your cultural attributes also compromises from your circumstantial recency and adaptation, and oftentimes these like cultural attributes come about from the very fact that you are a marginalized community in the first place. These things are two like diametrically affecting things that correspond to one another. The implication of this is that they fail to take into consideration how it's especially difficult for them to relinquish certain cultural attributes, given that they are still marginalized. For example, this looks like the black term pimp, right? Which stands possibly for cool economic connotation, because for black people, because they have been structurally excluded from popular like traditional job opportunities, they turn it into this kind of hustle jobs, and that is a different meaning to them than it is to white people. But when they say these terms, they don't apply the same. But when they use it, they reaffirm the historical black experience they've had thus far, and it's something that's only exclusive to them and their understanding. This looks like, for example, religious practices of certain people. For example, the Hanong people in Vietnam who do not like build an altar to worship the ancestors, traditionally like moving from place to place, and then because of like certain difficulties, these look like, for example, like practices, for example, like black ballroom culture, where because of the racism they experience in the drag culture, they move away into ballroom and create their own safe space there. These things then are extremely difficult and extremely valuable for these communities, and therefore they should not be used. The implication of this frame is twofold. One, it challenges OG's likelihood of success. Why? Because these communities are not marginalized for their cultural attributes. They are marginalized for who these VA people are. Relinquishing your cultural attributes does not change that context. You cannot just become another person, or like to the very least, you don't become another person to the people who are judging you. They ask you where they come from, they ask you who you are, and to the extent in which these things are very contingent on your identity, it's hard for you to let these things go, and it's hard for you to buy the opt-in. But on the second level, it's more important because look, it invokes an opportunity cost that VS case cannot do the trade-off against. The compromise is the culture hurts your, like the compromise of your own culture hurts your identity. It's very, very important. Why? One is that you lose that validation connection to your people, to your history, and do note that to the extent in which these people have been marginalized throughout their lives, throughout their history, it leaves a very deep impression on their esteem. In which case, this is the culture that gives it some of it back. So maybe it's the case that your people go into the world, make some money, but who are they? What do they do? Why is it the case that who they are can't be accepted by the rest of society? On the second level, you submit to a false choice. You give in. Why? On both sides of the house, society gives you a statement. We hate you. We want you to fit in. If you want to fit in, you must do so by proving that you are the least of who you are. And then we'll consider how it works, because do note that on government, they cannot prove certainty. So on government, right, BR says, okay, we will take that choice. On Win says no, that's a terrible choice. As a collective society, we reserve the right to say no. So I do understand that there's a certain level of trade-off here. I'm not going into it. How do we weigh this off? I want to bring back the angle of this being an actor debate, right? So BR says this, like, the reason why we have a duty to do this as a leader is because we have a duty to protect our people by giving them jobs. This is not real analysis, it's just something that is asserted. I think Aquino then steps behind the back, right? He explicitly pointed out that young people are leaving these communities, they are more liberal and they don't feel attachment. In fact, they resent the communities. What that means is that Aquino concedes that even in status quo, sometimes and oftentimes people have the capacity to break off of these communities anyway. These communities and these cultures are like not so strong. These leaders don't hold it together and therefore don't constrain the people that stand. What that means is to the best of their ability, if it's the case that on an individual basis, the individual from this community makes a personal choice of breaking away in order to self-actualize themselves in like the larger economy, they do have the capacity to do so. What is weaker is the sense of community and cultural practices that build up these communities for who they are. In which case, it benefits the people who cannot co-opt themselves into the comparative, into the larger economy. Which is why it's more important for the leader to hold these communities together, to assert that this is important, therefore we will not compromise. Before I go on, I'll take a few.
Younger minorities leaving doesn't mean they fracture. It just means that the interests of each minority diversify and change over time. It's only an open government where we accommodate both possibilities. How do you try to accommodate both possibilities on opening up?
Right. But this like idea of a community is abstract. We need to talk about specifically what the leader wants, what he needs to do in order to serve the most amount of people. So I'm doing the comparative here. Look, if it's the case that your individual has no affinity to the culture, he has great like talent and accessibility because he has like worked very long for stamina and he has like the hustle culture. As an individual, he's able to break free, right? The social factors, in fact, allows him to break free and forces him and causes him to break free. But for the majority of people who cannot, they need a figurehead and a central figure to affirm that the culture is important, that we want to keep it as alive as long as possible because it gives value to the people who are living in it. So as the leader, we prefer for you to protect the people by telling them that there's meaning in their culture, there's indispensable meaning that cannot be compromised. We want these leaders to tell young people that they shouldn't leave, that there is in fact a value that is not reflective if it's the case that you break away and you join other countries, and convince them, even if they believe that, okay, there's meaning community, you send that amount of money back, then you shouldn't use it to like self-actualize as an individual on your own, because it's drastically much more difficult. For all these reasons, please side with opening opposition.
All right, thank you very much. To the DLO for that speech. I'm going to use a 1 minute washroom break. Sorry, I'll be back very shortly.
Okay, I will do the same.
Is Cormac back in? You can just wait for a bit.
Sorry, I'm back.
All right, cool. To start off the second half of the debate, inviting the member of government for here.
I'll take PYs in chat, please. I've got so much paper for 2 speeches. Alrighty. Opening opposition talks about the importance of culture in this debate. The difficulty for them is it's difficult for them to prove that the importance of that culture is inherent to the specific way that that culture is practiced now, because of the simple fact that cultures change over time. The ways in which those cultures are practiced change over time. And I would say that the linking factor is not the inherent way that that culture is practiced right now, but actually the community that practices that culture, the community keeps it together. That's the importance of culture that we say on Closing Government. What we're going to do is analyze how this debate actually plays out. 3 things I'm going to do. Firstly, I'm going to talk about framing, then I'm going to deliver our extension, then I'm going to deal with that trade-off very explicitly. And lastly, if I have time, I'm going to get to some direct rebuttal to opening opposition. Let's deal with the framing then first. Firstly, let's talk about the wording of this motion, because this motion is not that minorities should all give up all of their cultural aspects all the time. This is about leaders of the communities urging minorities to make that trade-off. And that's an important distinction that I'm going to analyze in our extension, and not one that is touched on in the opening half. Secondly, these cultures are already declining. And opening opposition says, well, opening government just asserts these cultures are declining. But the reason these cultures are declining in minority communities is because of the reasons that opening opposition gives you in their speeches, which is that the majority wants to oppress the minority in these ways. They don't want to offer jobs to these people, which means they do not have disposable income. They want to oppress these cultures and make their culture the predominant one in society. Also things such as globalization, so the whole world being more interconnected, cultures don't stay insular as much anymore, which means that these cultures are already dying out under the status quo, and that is something that opening opposition has to contend with. They do not provide an alternative to these cultures to survive under their world. The last thing I want to touch on in framing is that minority communities exist in countries where there is a large majority, but often there are multiple groups of minority communities, and the way in which the state effectively oppresses these communities is by dividing them and conquering, not allowing them to unify and collectivize in a political action. That's also something I'm going to touch on in extension. So let's then deal with our extension. What is the current narrative in these marginalized minority communities? The thing is that these communities, under the status quo, recognize the importance of culture and sustaining these unique cultural aspects. That is something that's passed down through generations. Parents tell their children, you should protect the unique aspects of our culture. You should practice it in this specific way. And that's because the reasoning behind this is possibly because they face persecution for these beliefs in the past and the way that they practice this culture, and therefore they feel it's important as a connection to historically for them to maintain this specific aspect and the ways that it's practices. What does this therefore manifest as? This means that parents tell their children to protect this culture at all costs. There's significantly high pressure on children to maintain these specific practices of this culture. It means, for example, that they form very insular communities because they think if their culture is allowed to be practiced outside their community, or if other people from other communities might have access to that culture, it may in some way debase the culture. It may make it less special. It means that they discourage things like forming friendships and marriages outside of these communities because they become quite insular in that way. And they worry that sharing that culture will degrade it. This is the case even where there are minority communities with only marginal differences between them. For example, if you talk about the specific way that you're practicing the culture as being incredibly important, and another community practices culture in a slightly different way, those communities are encouraged to be insular from one another so that they do not overlap and their cultures, debase each other and get co-opted in that way. And that's incredibly harmful because the way in which these communities become insular prevents them from collectivizing, as I'm going to touch on. How do we therefore create benefit under our side? And this is where the analysis of the wording of the motion comes in. Because of the fact that leaders are urging people urging members of these communities to make this trade-off. That does not mean every member of this community is going to sacrifice every aspect of their cultural lives. In fact, as opening opposition touches on, the leaders in these communities do not have infinite power. People listen to them to an extent, but they're not going to listen to them if they hold these cultural beliefs incredibly deeply, such that they are incredibly personally important to them, and then they will suddenly give up all of these cultural beliefs. In fact, people are likely to do this in a very reasoned way based on the extent to which they value personally the practice of these cultures in these specific ways, which means it's not going to be done particularly badly under government's world. What we do is we go against the status quo narrative, which says you must practice culture in these specific ways, you must not allow it to be practiced by anyone else. We say, actually, you should not hold it so dearly to your heart. You should be willing to change the way that culture is practiced. You should be willing to adapt into the future. That means you're more willing to open up your communities and your cultures to more people, which leads to a few things. Firstly, it leads to massive amounts of social mobilization, which, for example, you open up your communities to help from other communities. This particularly looks like the case with multiple marginalized communities. If they're more accepting of their cultures, they allow more people to cross over between those groups. They're more likely to have discussions about political mobilization, more likely to advocate collectively for their own interests, which means that you're more able to advocate for political change in a world where you're already marginalized. That creates a huge, huge benefit because of the way that the state divides and conquers these people under the status quo. Secondly, it means more engagement by your people generally with others. And this co-opts the opening government's benefit they try to talk about in terms of jobs. Because if it is the case that opening opposition says that, well, majority communities won't give you jobs anyway, but members of other marginalized communities may give you jobs if they are more receptive to people from these other marginalized communities and therefore open their communities up to this types of crossover. Thirdly, insofar as this opens up your culture, moreover, I'll take opening opposition because I'm running out of time there. Okay.
Your argument is contingent on proving that these minorities have agency to determine how in which this culture is used. At the point where you let go of your cultural aspects, you can't have fear to say how these majority communities will use your culture.
No, because your culture is still practiced by you individually. Like, why do these marginalized communities care if some other people practice their culture in some different way? If they can still practice it themselves the way that they like, we think that's the most important benefit. They should be able to practice it individually. The last thing I want to say in terms of the benefit is, insofar as this opens up your culture to more people, that leads to increased integration in the way that it not only are you assimilating with the majority culture, but you are exposing the majority culture to your own culture, making your own culture more acceptable, which means you're more likely to be accepted in the future. Lastly, I want to deal with this trade-off very explicitly. Because this is only about urging, we say this provides a counter-narrative to the status quo, and therefore it is likely to be done well. People are not likely to give up aspects that are incredibly important personally to them. That means a few things. Firstly, they're going to still maintain those aspects that are personally important to them. Secondly, we say the important part of the culture is not the inherent way that it is practiced, but the community and the community behind that culture. And insofar as you keep those communities together and allow them to thrive, we think that is the greatest benefit in the debate. Thirdly, political mobilization is more important because it allows you access to your inherent rights. It allows you to have those benefits. And fourthly, political mobilization is logically prior to the other benefits in this debate, because if you have those rights to access, you're more able to protect your culture into the future by politically mobilizing. That's why closing government should take this debate.
All right. Thank you very much to the member of Gov for that speech. Now for the extensions from CO, inviting the member of opposition. You're here.
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, thanks. Right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. So I think the problem with OG is that they prove a bunch of ways in which life is getting better for minorities, and yet that oppression means that they have to change their name, change their culture, and therefore assimilate. Riv specifically says that there are a lot of incentives to hire these people. He says that they're cheaper labor, they try hard, so we should take, like, it makes economic sense to take them. I will also add that increasingly legislative protection solves for a lot of the problems that Bayer wants. So for example, the requiring or strongly encouraging blind application, diversity hiring in the status quo. All of these mean that I think the extent of oppression they talk about is less than ever before, and the need for this policy is less than ever before. But note, Riv also proves the alternative means of jobs that don't need you to pander to traditional majority acceptance. Things like the internet, things like being extremely tech savvy, which have opened up so many opportunities for remote work, for different styles of making money as a community that don't require you to be keyed into the formal economy. I'll also note that many of these communities have intra-existing community economies, right? Like community like shops and whatnot that allow them to be self-functioning to a fairly significant degree, with some degree of government aid that tends to come regardless, welfare systems, benefits for minority groups, etc. So I'm not convinced that the alternative is economic ruin as OG sets up. And more importantly, I'm not convinced the leader believes that the alternative is economic ruin, because these individuals are likely to believe in the existence of these past traditions that can continue to succeed moving forward. The only comment I'm going to say on cultural appropriation is I don't care. I think commercial forces much bigger than you try to appropriate your culture, whether as an individual you agree or not, does not shift the tipping point very much. So in CO, what I want to do is refocus on the interests of the leader and their perspective. I want to note that from this fellow's interest, there is likely to be high uncertainty from Bayer's idea that we get your foot in the door. First and foremost, because like outside being the leader, I'm actually uncertain how much getting a foot in the door changes the extent to which people are willing to accept you. It seems to me that if people are going to be racist against your name, they were going to be equally racist when you walked into the interview and showed up in a different skin color, showed up with a different educational background. I'm not convinced that distinction was going to make much of a difference. But second and more importantly, I also think the identity of this leader's perspective on what is good and necessary does not necessarily form around money. Rather, I posit it forms around things like culture, things like solidarity. And the reason for this is important. We often like to think that our identity is formed based on our experience, on our innate sense of what we want to be. But the reality is that's not true. In reality, more often than not, we post facto rationalize what our identity is based on trying to make the best for ourselves and craft the best, most comforting narrative for ourselves, given a world that tends to not give us what we want. Minority communities, for example, you think they didn't want to succeed in capitalism, but in the end, a big part of their community becomes centered around the idea of jazz music and hip hop for the African American community, for example. The point I'm trying to make here is that these individuals are likely to have previously post facto rationalized that given they weren't going to hit the top ranks of like commercial success, that other things are more important, like this culture and like solidarity and like their position within that community. But more than that, I also want to note that their views tend to be somewhat hierarchical. First, because they tend towards tradition, which tends to serve the purpose of entrenching the power of the old who are gatekeepers of these traditions. But second, also because they tend to oppose things like democracy. One, because this is seen as divisive, which you can't afford within such a small community. Two, because it's seen as a majority imposition on you. But three, especially in a context where you feel the freedom to decree or encourage the loss of culture, which is likely to lead to some degree of blowback, but yet still believe that you have the ability to do this, it's likely that the extent to which you believe in your hierarchical ability to impose what is right on you think is right on the community is high. The conclusion to this bit of framing is that you likely believe, one, in the integrity of the community being important, and you care about your specific iteration of culture you think is best. But second, you also believe to some extent in your personal power, whether this is for Machiavellian reasons or because you believe that you are the best person to lead the community and short of you, the community will be lost. I think that therefore you believe that you being in a position of power is critical. OG.
Jazz and hip hop succeeded because eventually white people bowed to them. Culture diffusion is good because it exports their culture. But more importantly, if you want to be tech savvy, you need to learn English, you need to set up a business. You obviously still need to appropriate to an extent.
So we need to center this back to the real world. Obviously, education systems exist that teach you majority languages to some extent anyway. The question, and I'm going to move into is now things like losing your accents. The cultural appropriation thing, I don't care. If Naomi will deal with it. What do you realistically lose in social integration? I think you lose stuff like accents and name that is the most important. I'm willing to concede that to some extent. More charitable to themselves, Gulf would admit that some degree of code switching might be possible, preservation of culture within smaller groups. Why then do we still need to maintain our culture? I think this is because culture is about suffering, and this will fill in OO's gap, because OO says culture is good, but they're vulnerable to CG that says cultures can change. The problem is that no matter how much cultures change, what you can't have as this leader is a loss of the parts of your culture that make you distinct, because it is basic rituals of speech that remind you of yourself and assert you against others. Every time you speak and recognize that you are different, when people don't necessarily understand everything you say, that might be annoying, but it also reminds you that you are of that different culture and that is never going to go away. That develops a pride in your culture, but more than that, even if you don't, I'm proud of it, an identity with your culture. And that's why, for example, Singaporean debaters for the longest time resisted sounding white within debating. This is very similar to religion, right? And how the rituals of religion and forcing you to practice things like fasting are important to having you believe and recognize and identify with that religion. But more than that, being rejected and having room to believe that it's because of culture strengthens your sense of self as well, because those processes of rejection make you recognize that your culture is what makes you feel that it is important, and potentially more important than short-term things like the marginal increase in the chance of a job. The implication of this is that short of these cultural practices and rituals, the sense of group identity is going to decrease on Gov's side. Why is that a problem for you? One, as the leader, you tend to believe in its importance as an a priori good on that side of the house, right? As I've explained before. But second, it is about decreasing the amount of respect that you have from that community. Because note that as this leader, you are relying on a very vague notion of buy-in. You have no redistributive ability within this group. You have no power like the state to enforce your will upon these people. All you have is the fact that people within your community believe and identify with you. Especially if Riv wants to say that you have reduced extent of belief in belonging, you are all the more important at this point in time because the rituals of belonging are all you have to keep your hold over your people and consequently keep your ability to influence the future of a community that you clearly, strongly identify with and want benefit from. In order to do that, the worst thing you can do on GovBench is to lose that very sense of identity that keeps you relevant. That is why we oppose.
All right. Thank you very much to the member of opposition for that speech. Now for the whip speeches, to summarize the cases for both sides of the House. Let's first hear from the Gov whip. Here.
Just give me a moment, thanks. The first thing I want to note at the outset of this speech is that our extension did not get a single response from closing opposition, so hopefully OpWhip will be able to deal with it later on. I'm going to do three things. Firstly, I'm going to explain why our extension wins the debate, then I'm going to talk about closing opposition and rebut their extension, and lastly, I'm going to take opening opposition out of the debate. So let's deal with our extension first. Opening government says this debate is about the benefits of social integration, but does not actually prove that they will get that social integration in the future. Whereas we at closing government focus on the wording of the motion, how this urging actually plays out, and the aspects of which social culture of this culture that people are likely to retain, and the aspects that they are likely to give up are the ones that they do not personally care about the most, which means that the harm to these individuals is not particularly great in the first place. The other thing is that we outmake them by proving this integration better at closing government. When we show that you make these communities less insular, they're more likely to promote their culture around the country and therefore have more integration, especially with other minority communities who are more likely to politically mobilize for them in that sense. We also prove that political mobilization has far greater weight in this debate and that it is logically prior to everything that is talked about in terms of culture. Opening opposition says, well, this culture is particularly important, but do not provide an alternative for these communities, which we prove are structurally having their culture eroded in the status quo by majoritarian groups anyway. We prove that by being able to unify with other minority groups and able to collectivize and politically advocate, they have far more political power. They're able to implement reforms that are able to maintain their cultural practices into the future. So we're logically prior to opening opposition in that sense as well. Let's then deal with our extension. No response coming from closing opposition. What do we tell you? Firstly, this opens up insular communities in a particularly important way that allows them to politically motivate. Secondly, we told you that because of the wording of the motion, the way that this plays out is that people are not losing the practices that are most important to them, but rather they are giving up what they see that they do not need anymore. And you're countering the existing status quo narrative, which is that it is incredibly important to maintain these cultural practices specifically in the ways that your parents have taught you. We say that that is not important to these people. And thirdly, we told you specifically about the trade-off and why the weighing of this political mobilization is the most important claim in the debate, why it comes up of all of these cultural claims. Hopefully, OpWhip will respond to this. Let's then deal with the two sides of opposition house. Firstly, let's deal with closing opposition. They tell us a few things. The first thing they say is that, well, people will still be racist anyway. So even if you integrate socially, you're not going to create a huge benefit anyway. This is kind of reminiscent of the argument that opening opposition's already talked about. I've got a couple of responses. Firstly, our extension already proved that these jobs apply across these marginalized communities as well. So even if we do not prove that like the majoritarian communities are going to be less racist and let these people in, you have more exposure to other communities that are also marginalized, and they're more likely to grant you those jobs in the future. Secondly, by proving that you expose the world more to your culture, therefore you allow the majoritarian groups to become more accepting of your culture in the future, that allows you to that allows you to make these people less racist into the future. That allows you to make them more accepting and more willing to employ you, etc., into the future. So that is how we obtain that benefit. The second thing they say at closing opposition is, well, people actually care about their culture more because these are the things they value. A few responses here. Firstly, in order for this claim to actually matter in the debate, they have to prove that this will be done badly, i.e. that when people are urged by their leaders to make this trade-off, they immediately give up the aspects that they find incredibly important personally to them. And this is contrary to what opening opposition says, which is that these leaders do not have infinite power. People don't listen unconditionally to what they say. In fact, these leaders tie these groups together, but do not have massive authority over how people practice individually their own lives, which means that it is not going to be done badly. People are not going to just give up the most important facets of their life anyway. Secondly, when people do it well, they only give up those things that they do not personally value, so there is a benefit there. Thirdly, closing opposition also suffers from the problem of opening opposition, which is they do not prove that these these cultural practices are inherently important in the way that they are practiced now. Because these cultures shift massively over time, the way that they are practiced shifts over time. That means that the true thing that is tying importance to these cultures is the importance placed in the mind of these individual people. And if the community changes their view about what is important about their culture, which aspects of cultural practice are important to them, then there is no harm if you change the culture in that way, because no one is negatively affected by the change of that culture. No one feels that sense of loss in their culture if they've already accepted that changing their culture is an okay thing to do, which means that the harm on opposition bench literally does not exist. The next thing that closing opposition says is that, well, culture is about suffering, but this suffers from the same problem. They do not prove that this the way that people give up their culture will be done particularly badly, which means they do not prove the harm that happens under that point. I'll take opening opposition.
Culture might change, but it takes a really long time because you're reshaping people's lived experience. So it's a generational thing. In this interim, you're likely to lose the ability for a minority group to collectivize and the crew of impacts that we gave you.
Well, we don't need to prove that culture changes very, very quickly under the status quo. Just that the fact that culture changes over time and people still value the culture today, just as they valued the culture 100, 200 years ago, means that the value of culture is not inherent to the way it is practiced, but it is bred by the fact that communities place importance on it. And the importance that is placed on it by communities, if we change that, then there is no harm on opposition bench by changing the way the culture is practiced. Let's then deal with opening opposition. They say culture is about tying these communities together, and it is the only way to tie these communities together. A few responses. Firstly, that is wrong. The thing that ties these communities together the most are families, the communities themselves, having interactions with people around the place. Because even if you have specific cultural practices that are unique to your community, they're not done 24/7 most of the time. The most interactions you have with your community are face-to-face interactions, just seeing the people on your street. You have family members in that community that tie you together, which means that even if under opposition's world, all of this culture disappears at once and you have no culture tying you together anymore, you still have communities tying you together. You're still likely to be united in that sense. Secondly, you're not losing all the culture for the reasons I've told you about. This is just urging, which means you're only losing the aspects that people find unimportant. Thirdly, as I've already said, there's no inherent value to culture. If they do not value the culture they are losing, there is no harm. Then they say, well, these people cannot mobilize, but the status quo is they are marginalized. They cannot mobilize under the status quo. Opposition bench provides no alternatives to allow them to marginalize on their world. What we say is they need other groups to be able to collectivize. They need to open up their communities so that they find other communities that are willing to support them and politically mobilize in that sense. Then the last thing they say is safe spaces. We still get safe spaces to the extent that these communities are still together. We still get safe spaces to the extent that these communities only give up aspects of the culture that are not inherently important to them. And these are created by the community and not by the culture itself. They're created by the individuals in these communities. For those reasons, CG takes the debate.
All right. Thank you very much to the. Sorry, I'll Gov Whip for that speech. And to conclude this round as a whole, inviting the opposition whip. Here.
Hello, can I be heard and seen properly?
Yes.
Okay, POI screenshot. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. From the leader's perspective, what is the best way to respond to oppression? Obviously, people will listen to the leader because one, they're the leader for the reasons Shaun has told you. But secondly, if no one listens, there is no point to this debate. So this motion requires us to understand what the leader thinks is the better decision to make. Is it integration? Is it maintaining that important cultural identity? So first issue in this speech, let's deal with the clash on cultural appropriation just to get it out of the way and why that clash is absolutely irrelevant. Because independent of top half, there are external incentives for the majority to commit harmful appropriation anyway, and nothing anybody says in their 7-minute speeches can ever change this facet of reality. Because you have things like fetishization, where white people have no stake in cultural identities, can easily take whatever they want as what they see as an exotic piece of culture, tattoo it on their bodies. So they see these things as an object and not the benevolent white people that wants to learn about Filipino tattoos that is said in the DPM speech. But additionally, these are people who can easily commit theft. They can steal these designs and put it on their bags in their big corporations and sell it out with little to no repercussions because these minority communities have no means to sue big and hegemonic corporations who can easily do this to their will. And this is bad for opening government because OG contradict themselves because in a POI to win, Bea says that these powerful firms do bad things anyway, but their entire case at OG is contingent about how minorities can control that appropriation. So even OG in that POI recognizes the immense power of corporations, and that is a dangerous concession. But this is also bad for opening opposition because we agree, we are not knifing them, we agree that it is nice to not be appropriated, but for other reasons endemic in this world, appropriation is likely to happen anyway. So there is then no delta in the opening opposition case. What does this mean then? This means that the leader's green light for integration does not change anything in this aspect because the leader has no control over the manifestation and success of integration as a single actor when hedged against these more powerful forces in the world. This applies to the tech-savvy kids that DPM says, because if the kids hate their culture anyway, then they're likely to do things in any way that they want, regardless of whether the leader promotes integration or not. So what the leader says does not matter for these actors that DPM thinks is important. This responds to closing government because it proves that significant preservation of culture is unlikely in either side as long as corporations and powerful majorities exist who have the freedom to do whatever they want with very little repercussions. So you don't get the benefit of preservation. Moving on then, let's deal with opening government in chronological order. Shaun tells you that the problem with OG is them arguing integration equals benefits, right? But Shaun also initially says that there are ways to succeed as a minority community without the need of integration, which spins the entirety of opening government's material. But even if you don't buy that, right, there are inherent problems with their integration equals benefits because their only attempt at a mechanism is to say that you have a foot in the door, which obviously doesn't translate into success because it's dependent on how the majority group perceives you and gives you that success because they are in control of who gets promoted and they're in control of these powerful structures. And as a minority group, you are at risk of several things. One, not being accepted because of prejudice, because of your skin color. Shaun says that even if you change your name, when you walk into that interview room and they see your skin color, they're still likely to have these racist biases against you. You still have to compete with other white people who probably graduated from Ivy Leagues, who have a better background in education than you, who have connections, who doesn't have the need to adjust to a particularly new environment. But secondly, you lose the very identity that you find the most important to you. You come from a community where the leader indoctrinates you into believing that it's extremely important to your identity. Your mental health is likely to suffer. Your capacity to make rational decisions in this type of jarring context is extremely difficult. But thirdly, you're taken advantage of by the majority. As Riv says, you are a victim of cheap labor. You cannot complain because if you complain, you can easily be fired and your job be taken away by someone who is whiter, someone has a better and more privilege than you. These are things you have no leverage of as a minority, and therefore you're still likely to be a victim of abuse. You don't get that successful economic development and upliftment that opening government wants. And this is important because these harms over unproven future benefit of cultural diffusion and economic opportunities that Shaun already dissects with the extension. So OG's shopping list of speculative benefits ignores the guaranteed harms that disprove these economic benefits. So OG is not comparatively better. They're out of this debate. Given this, this ties back into the comparative that Shaun brings up, which is the missing opening opposition counterfactual. We prove that unlike the uncharitable abject poverty counterfactual that OG pushes, there are viable economic alternatives in closing opposition that works, because obviously the leader does not want their own people to starve to death, or else no one in their community is going to like them. They will obviously open up to a degree of economic upliftment, especially within these communities that Shaun already proved in the extension. Moving on to opening opposition, O has a lot of material for why culture is good and important. We agree, but the problem with the OO case is that they stop by saying that the leader wants to protect people, and this happens via preservation of culture. This does not happen because they need to explain how it happens within the leader's interest. So Shaun actually proves to you the mechanisms for how the leader operationalizes these unique cultural attributes. So it's not just about culture equals good. It's about culture as a form of rejection that keeps the leader relevant. This also deals with closing government, because Shaun does respond to CG in the speech compared to what Government Whip says, right? Because moving on to CG, the leader changes some people's minds to be more open, but CG also in the same breath says that this somehow manages to open up the community to massive social and political mobilization. And note that they give a laundry list of benefits that stems from this idea of mobilization, but they never prove the manifestation of that changing cultural identity that Shaun already deals with in the extension. Because one, mobilization is relative to the majority. The majority controls who gets to have a business permit. They control political representation, the degree you can participate in majority discussion. And it's already unlikely if you have that majority who wants to stay in power or already have incentives to keep their own people powerful within these structures. Before I move on to the second reason, I'll take a point from opening.
You say minorities are already privileged, but this has only happened because they've historically allowed cultural appropriation. Blind hiring and cultural protection has come because white people were interested. Any minority that refuses will die. And you already said that cultures change. So what's the harm?
You already said, you're the one who said that minorities are privileged because you give reasons for why they're able to uplift themselves independent of whether or not the leader says yes or no. The context of this debate, independent of these outside external structures, happen with what the leader says, which is exactly the contention that Shaun brings up in his speech. Second reason, collectivization of various minority groups does not happen in the real world because these cultural minorities are distinct from each other. CG just can't say, oh, you're all minorities, you'll be best friends, you will collectivize together and take over the majority. That's just not how it works in the real world. But thirdly, from the leader's perspective, even if they did care about all that social mobilization that CG says, this leader probably thinks that the best way to achieve social mobilization is not by having an external cultural identity. Rather, the internal cultural identity that Shaun is able to prove to you is within the leader's interest in the extension, because that rejection of culture is the strongest means that the leader thinks the culture is able to be preserved within that community. We think when you have these mechanisms already in place and already within the calculus decision-making of that leader, this is the far preferable alternative, and this is why we win this debate. For all these reasons, oppose.
All right. Thank you everyone for your very, very invigorating speeches. I invite everyone to virtually cross and shake hands. You may leave this room right now to allow for the judges to deliberate. We'll let you know when we're done. Thank you.
Thanks for the debate, everybody.
Thanks,
Woohoo.
Thanks for the
everyone.
round, everyone.
Thank you.
Oh, I don't consent to streaming my OA, sorry. All right, bye.
Since I was chasing, if I ever slip, I fall into a better situation. So catch up, go put some cheese on it, get out and get your bread up.